Now read a second time. I call the member for Maitland.
Thank you, Madam Speaker. I rise to speak on the point-to-point transport, taxis and hire vehicles bill of 2016, and I want to start by acknowledging the taxi service providers in my electorate who have come to see me to discuss the issues they are having with the disruption that they are suffering in this brave new world. I also acknowledge Mr Roy Wakelin-King in the gallery. I've known Roy for a number of years from my time working in the transport industry, and I met with him and Mr Emery, the CEO of Central Coast Taxis, some months ago with a member for Wyong, my predecessor in the small business portfolio. In fact, I spoke to Mr Wakelin-King last night, and he's been a great advocate for the many small businesses in this space. And as someone who myself worked in the transport industry in New South Wales for some 17 years prior to my entry to this place, I have a very good understanding of Transport for New South Wales and the challenges that operators have been faced with emerging technologies and consumer behaviours that are changing so quickly in transport. The single most important issue in transport is safety. In my own company, we worked through the implementation under the former Labor government of one of the most comprehensive safety management systems in Australia, which puts the onus on operators to keep their heavy vehicles safe and compliant, and that their drivers were safe and caring for passengers properly. New South Wales under Labor was seen as raising the bar on safety in public transport in terms of vehicles, for passengers and for the wider road-using community, and also in ensuring that employee records, the most important aspect required to ensure employees were paid properly, were implemented and comprehensive. These changes were very important for the viability of public transport in our state, to ensure that public transport, which is the core tool for reducing congestion, was able to continue to operate efficiently and effectively on a statewide level. There were difficult times for operators. There were difficult changes for them and their staff, but they were done with transparency, clarity and communication with the sector. Labor takes its obligations to protect safety of all road users and passengers to ensure drivers are paid properly very seriously. Now we see another significant area of change in the transport industry, point-to-point transport, taxis and hire cars that provide the links between mass transit systems of ferries, trains and buses are undergoing fundamental changes. Earlier this month I heard from Gary Ellen, a thought leader at Newcastle University, who spoke about transport and the opportunities and challenges of emerging technologies in this area. And I have to say it was seriously mind-blowing. The opportunities of technology in the field of transport will transform the way we move around communities. The ability of computers to change point-to-point technology systems has changed not just taxis, but into the future there will be significant changes for group point-to-point travel, that is buses. And then there are the driverless cars. I spoke to Gary about this issue, as in a region like mine, which has had such high unemployment relative to the rest of the state for such a long time under this government, and with such a reliance on heavy vehicle drivers in our economy, I wanted to know how I would be able to ensure that jobs would still be available for members of our community in such an environment. Gary was very positive about the opportunities for employment. He talked about how seriously growing public transport in our communities would enable us to come to a point that public transport was frequent enough, cost efficient enough and better for people, to the extent that they might make a permanent move away from their cars. And in the short term, that would create more work, much more work for bus drivers. And then in the final analysis, if we did go to driverless cars, then we would still need to have the car equivalent of a flight simulator to take over in the event of breakdowns, accidents or other emergencies. Or we might have a return to people being employed to actually provide the safety and security and social interaction that drivers provide in vehicles. They might be conductors, they might be security guards, and even with more reliable and accessible public transport for people with disabilities, there might even be carers. These are all amazing opportunities for the community, but they require us to grapple with enormous challenges and risks to small businesses and governments such as those, and they are raised in the bill that we're here to debate today. How will we provide a level playing field for taxis, hire cars and Uber drivers when it comes to CPT green slips? How will we ensure that women, people with disabilities, young people and other vulnerable members of our community are not exposed to safety issues when they travel as passengers? When the government is no longer going to authorise drivers of vehicle under RMS, what will this do for passenger safety? they'll have to have undergone criminal background checks and medicals, as well as the requirement to have a licence. But how in this new environment will we ensure that there will be centralised agency oversight of the suitability of drivers? We have seen this happen in other industries. Sometimes consumers need to be protected for their own good. We saw the government's failure to do this and their desire to just throw their hands up when they can't get their head around the technology. Indeed, when the government couldn't work out a way to deal with the burgeoning problem of fraud in the booking of travel agent arrangements over the internet, instead of strengthening the protections to consumers and indeed the industry, we saw them dismantle the travel agency's travel compensation fund, leaving consumers totally unprotected and forcing travel agents who had paid high entrance fees to get into the industry left struggling to pay ongoing fraudulent insurances to provide the same protections to their customers. Yet again, now in this bill, we see the government letting an international operator with an aggressive policy of non-compliance compete with those mums and dads who year on and year out have been providing a service to our community. Where has the government been in the last 12 months, indeed the last few years, when Uber commenced their operations in Australia? Luckily, it was the Leader of the Opposition, Luke Foley, who had the foresight a year ago to see that consumer behaviour was moving far more quickly than the government on this issue and called for regulation on this issue. It's such a pity that the government has not embraced taxi owners in compensation and the risks that this change has placed onto their small businesses. The compensation package is not adequate for those taxi drivers who paid a small fortune, and it was all they had, to buy themselves a job just to try and provide a service to our community. Only now, on the one-year anniversary of the Leader of the Opposition's budget and reply speech, we see government comes in with a package that is frankly insulting to the many mums and dads who scrimped and saved to get a taxi plate and then worked their guts out to pay it back and provide for their families. When I was growing up, we lived next door to a taxi-owning family. This family wasn't rich. They worked hard. They had a large market garden that they spent their waking hours tending to provide food for their family and supplemented that with the income they got from driving all night in the taxis. They weren't rich. They weren't entitled. They weren't leaners. They were real workers. I saw the struggles and the sacrifices they made to keep their taxis on their road and provide for their families. This bill should be looking to do more about the mums and dads, not the investors. These are mum and dad small businesses who didn't just make a bad investment decision. They worked for hours a day to pay off the job that they had bought for themselves when they bought their taxi plates. They didn't just make a bad investment decision. They didn't just throw their money on the property market, which didn't accelerate. They didn't just throw their money on the stock market. They bought, and often as migrants, a job for themselves. I'm also concerned, Madam Speaker, for the cherry-picking of routes and event times in regional areas. It's hard enough to run a taxi in a regional area like Maitland. We don't have the ability, like we do here in Sydney, to just walk outside this door and hail a cab. We have operators who, for many parts of the day, are struggling to make an income. The peak times of events, the peak events that happen in our areas provide them with a little bit of incentive to continue their work. We also need to look at the fairness of compensation. How can hire cars vehicles get a $60,000 compensation package and taxis only get $20,000? And more importantly, the adjustment package only applies to those who purchase taxi plates after the 1st of July 2015. Although New South Wales taxi licence prices have been falling since 2012, when they were selling for well over $400,000, in the past year there have been more than 70 licences sold for between $200,000 and $332,000. Where's their compensation? What about those 70 people, those 70 mums and dads who purchase taxis? What compensation will they get? Although the bill does not address the amount of compensation, how was the magic figure of $250,000 determined? What modelling was done to find out how much money the consumer levy would raise? I also want to ask, why aren't we looking at industry assistance packages as we have for other industries like forestry, like water, like dairy, river red gums and marine? And most importantly, why does the Minister have discretion? If there are differences in situations which need a different solution, and I acknowledge that there are very large operators in this state who operate taxis, but there's also small mums and dads. We have a huge gap between the operators. And if that's the case, which it clearly is, then we need to ensure that solutions are implemented with transparency and clarity. And I would have to say that his Transport Minister has not demonstrated that in many of his dealings with my community. You only have to look at the thought processes of someone who rips up a rail line and 18 months later we have nothing to show to replace it. And that's the kind of deal that we're going to get from this minister for the taxi industry, and it's just not enough. Thank you.